My name is Father Tom Zinkula. It's good to be with you. So let's begin with prayer. I'm going to read, since we're into the Bible today, I'm going to read a passage from Matthew 19, 3-9. Some Pharisees approached Jesus and tested him, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause whatever?" He said in reply, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, no human being must separate." They said to him, "Then why did Moses command that the man give the woman a bill of divorce and dismiss her?" He said to them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery." Almighty and eternal God, you have so exalted the unbreakable bond of marriage that it has become the sacramental sign of your Son's union with the Church as his spouse. We thank you for the holy gift of married love, a sacred union in which two hearts are fused as one. We pray that married couples may grow in love for each other, that they may resolve to be of one heart in the bond of peace. In their joys, may they see that you are the source and completion of every happiness. Recognizing that married life is not always easy, we ask that you lighten the trials and clear the path of couples who are struggling in their marriage. Reach out and touch their hearts. Heal whatever needs to be healed and give them new hope. In their struggles, may they rejoice that you are near to help them. And may the Church always walk with them as a companion on the journey. Be present in a special way to those who are divorced and those who are in the process of divorcing. May whatever needs to be reconciled be reconciled. As they grieve the death of their marriage and seek a new beginning, may they turn to you for help and support. Be present as well to those who are engaged in the annulment process. May they be patient and understanding as they work their way through this process step by step. May it provide them with healing and closure. May it help them better understand themselves and their former marriage. Grateful for your unconditional and everlasting love, we ask all this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. All right, so what I propose to do, well, first of all, what do I bring to this talk? What is my expertise that I can share with you? So I've been in parishes most of my priesthood. Right now I'm not. I work with seminarians, but I've associate pastor, then pastor of various parishes. So I have that pastor experience working with folks, in marriage situations and divorces and annulments and those kinds of things. And I also have a degree in canon law, so I've always balanced pastoral ministry as well as a ministry in our tribunal. So I've worked, I know annulments inside and out. It's been part of my gig all along. So anyway, so I know that whole world, witnessing marriages and working with couples to prepare for marriage and supporting couples in their marriages and counseling them, and then also the other side of it when marriages fall apart, and keeping people connected to the Church and helping them to work through the annulment process to be free to marry again if they so choose. So what I'd like to do is just talk about marriage, and we're not married so much as when a marriage doesn't go well and it comes apart. We talk about divorce, how to keep people connected to the Church. So some of you are probably guessing you've been divorced, or you're in the divorce, you're divorcing right now. So you're kind of looking for something from that perspective. Others of you perhaps know people who are kind of in that situation and you want to support them along the way. So I'm going to talk about staying connected to the church. How do you do that when you're divorced or you're going through the divorce? And also about annulments. There's lots of misinformation, misunderstanding about annulments out there, so I can hopefully help clear that up. So is that what you're looking for, everybody? Okay. And then at the end, I'll give you like 10 minutes or something. They're going to give us a 10-minute warning, or at least 10 minutes to ask questions. So be thinking about, people always have questions about, I've talked about this sort of thing a ton of times, and there's always tons of questions. So kind of file those away. All right, so marriage, as we all know and believe, is a sacrament. And so the church, when a marriage is, a couple struggling in a marriage, the church tries to keep the couple together and to keep the marriage intact. Of course, that's going to be what we start with. And so that for the sake of the couple, for the sake of the children, that's what we're to do. There's a canon that says that, 1676, to do all you can to keep the marriage together. So of course, that's where we're going to start. So we have, Catholic Charities that a couple can go to for counseling, and go to their pastor for counseling. We have different resources here in town. Excuse me. Mount Mercy University has a marriage and family clinic that offers counseling with a sliding fee scale for couples and families. And of course, Catholic Charities, theirs is a sliding fee scale as well. So we have resources that help couples to try to keep their marriage together. But we all know that sometimes there are reasons for a married couple to separate and divorce. There's human weakness and sin, and people can't get past that. They just can't get past it. Perhaps there's abuse, psychological or physical abuse, and so the church would say, leave that situation if you can't get that resolved. So sometimes marriages end for the sake of the couple, for the sake of the children. I mean, sometimes it's better maybe that couples separate and divorce for their sake and for the sake of assets, perhaps. There's different reasons why people should probably split up. And I found that it's impossible to work things out when one of the spouses has checked out. If somebody comes to me and they want the marriage, they want to work on their marriage, but the other person doesn't want to, it's just not, it can't happen. It has to take both of you. So sometimes people reluctantly go through a divorce, get divorced. And that's why, so the church has a process, the annulment process. And the church herself says when there's an affirmative decision that some marriages aren't valid. The church says there's no marriage bond sometimes. I mean, once I as a judge, I got a petition for an annulment. It was from a woman who had been married, I can't remember, it was either like 49 or 59 years, for a long time. This is a while ago, I can't remember the exact details. So I contacted her pastor, and I said, really, she's not going to get remarried. Why are we doing this, taking all this time and processing this annulment? And he told me that she needs the church to say something that she herself knows in her heart, that this was not a marriage. It's that many years. So okay, that's fine. People have a right to ask the church to look at their marriage. Anybody, Catholic, not Catholic, maybe somebody's marrying a Catholic, wants to marry a Catholic in the church, and so they have a right to ask the church to look at their marriage. And she wasn't going to remarry, but she wanted the church to say what she knew. And so in this situation, so this guy was abusive. He was an abusive alcoholic. He basically spent his day at the bar, and she worked the farm. And she actually she actually left him about halfway through for a year, and then he kind of sweet talked her into coming back, and he's changed, but it never changed. And so finally, her life was in danger because they were working on the farm doing something, and she got injured somehow, and he just walked away. And it wasn't a critical, an injury that was going to lead to death, but it could have been something like that. So she's like, this was not a marriage, and she wanted the church. She had the church she needed the church just to say that, just for her own closure and healing and her own well-being. So, we worked it through, and it was this big, long, a lot of kids, a lot of years, and people would say, well, gosh, how can you give an annulment? Well, there was no love there all that time. That was back in the day when you marry, and you stay in that marriage no matter what, even if it's dangerous for you to do so, and there's a lot of abuse and everything. So anyway, when one's marriage is ending or has ended, it's easy to become disconnected from the church, from one's Catholic faith, because, I don't know, people feel sorry for themselves, they have self-pity, it's kind of hard to pray when in difficult times. It's hard to keep focused on God when we're feeling pain and we're suffering, whether that's because of a divorce situation, a marriage unraveling, or because of grief or depression or illness. That's just kind of the way it goes. It's hard to pray. I'm not feeling so close to God, maybe, and divorced people often feel guilt and shame at not being able to keep their marriage intact. Somebody emailed me yesterday. I witnessed this gal's marriage, I don't know, probably 15 years ago, and she got divorced last year, and she was kind of, she sent me this email, and she felt really bad about it. She felt shame. She felt bad for me because I was the one who witnessed the marriage. It's like, oh, gosh, okay, these things happen, and it's life goes on. But so people feel a sense of failure. They don't maybe feel worthy enough to go to church, and sometimes people feel uncomfortable attending Mass alone, on my own, and it's just, this is weird. People, what are they thinking and stuff, especially if it's a smaller parish. It's painful to see other families together at church. But, divorce in and of itself is not a sin. It's not a sin. I mean, it doesn't mean that the divorced persons are not holy or worthy of God's love. They're still part of their own family, even if perhaps the person's living alone at this point or that point, and they're still part of the family that is the church. So yeah, probably there was some sin on both sides in this marriage and in its failure, there's sin in all areas of our lives, including in marriage. But just the fact that someone is divorced doesn't mean that they are outside of the church by any means. Seems to be this notion that we have to be perfect to attend Mass and to be part of a parish or church. And that's somehow we give that impression to people, and it's totally unfortunate. It makes me so sad when someone leaves the church when they're struggling. I mean, they need the church even more than, like the Son of Man has come to seek and save what was lost. If I feel lost, then I need to. Then the Son of Man is there for me and wants to bring me home. The church it's kind of a saying, this popular saying, the church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. So, when someone's struggling, there's the sacraments for them there. When they're going through a divorce, or they're divorced, there's a Eucharist, there's reconciliation. Because, there's probably some sin there, so it needs to be reconciled. It's take advantage of that sacrament. Maybe there needs to be the anointing of the sick because of emotional or psychological pain. And there's a need to have a community to walk with someone who's struggling because of a failed marriage. I can share a parallel in my own life in terms of loss and feeling alone. The hardest thing for me as a priest is not celibacy, although that's hard and everything. People think, oh gosh, that must be the biggest thing, the hardest thing. But I don't feel alone because of celibacy. I'm alone, but I don't feel lonely because of it. The time I feel most alone and I feel lonely is when I change assignments. So there I am in a parish with the parish family, and it's my family, and I'm living my life with them, and then I have to leave that family and go to another parish. I know I'm going to get involved with these people and start loving them eventually, and it'll be all good. But there's that transitional period that's really hard for me. It's the hardest thing in the priesthood for me. And so I have my family of origin, my sisters and brothers and stuff, and I have friends and everything. But I can't expect them to just kind of leave everything and kind of hold my hand for a few days, few weeks during this transitional period. And, so I feel alone, and I realize that how much I need God at times like that. It's like I've been taking God for granted. Things are good, and who needs God? I'm fine. But when I'm alone in that situation, and it's really hard, then I realize how much I need God. It's just really ultimately it comes down to God and me, or God and you. No one can be there for us totally. People get sick on us. They sin. People let us down. They die on us. Nobody can be there totally for us except for God. So, situation with the divorce, when someone's feeling all alone, that's when we really need to lean on God. And we can draw closer to Him times like that, maybe than when things are going well. So to be looking for that, praying the Psalms is huge. When things are really tough, like in a divorce situation, God's grace can really break through in those situations. It's hard, it's going to be hard, but at the same time, there can be some grace that takes place there. So, the church wants to be there for people in that situation. Pope Francis talks about going to the peripheries. He says, how I would like a church that is poor for the poor. Those are situations where we need to be there for people. People are feeling very poorly at that time about themselves. They're hurting, and so the church needs to be there. And people hopefully are open. Stay connected to the community. Pope Francis, in an interview, said this a while back: the thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds, heal the wounds. And you have to start from the ground up. So, just like the church is there for people when there's couples when a marriage is having difficulties, also the church is there, tries to be there for people when the marriage has ended and there's been a divorce. So there's a program called Divorce and Beyond, which is a parish-based support program for separated and divorced Catholics, and its objective is to help participants deal with the emotion of their loss. Is to help people, with acceptance of this situation of a divorce, with healing and forgiveness. It's peer-to-peer ministry, so there are support groups that are guided by trained facilitators. There's 8 weekly sessions. And in the Cedar Rapids area, a lot of guys here are from Cedar Rapids area, so St. Ludmila's has this program, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, and St. Pius. So that's something for people who are in need of that kind of support. Just to kind of clear up any perhaps confusion or misunderstanding about reception of sacraments. When someone is separated or divorced, they can receive the sacraments. Okay? Divorce is a civil thing. It has nothing to do with the church. We still see the couple as being married but not living together. So they're still in good standing in the church. They can be Eucharistic ministers, lectors on parish pastoral council, just like anybody else. There's no, stigma attached. There shouldn't be, with divorce in terms of someone's place in the church. So the rub comes though when someone divorces and then remarries outside of the church. So remarries civilly, or in some other church or something without getting a dispensation. So that becomes problematic. So, but still, even in that situation, pastors and parishes are called to welcome people openly and sincerely, to stand with them sympathetically and helpfully, to make them aware of the love of the Good Shepherd. So they still belong to the church. They're in an irregular situation, they can't receive the sacraments, but they are still entitled to pastoral care, and they should take part, hopefully, in the church's life. So here's another quote. This is from a message to the people of God at the conclusion of the 2012 Synod of Bishops on the new evangelization. So here's what they said. God's love does not abandon anyone. The church loves divorced and remarried people. The church is a house that welcomes all. They remain members of the church even if they can't receive the sacramental absolution and the Eucharist. May our church communities welcome all who live in such situations and support those who are on the path of conversion and reconciliation. So if someone's divorced, they're just like anybody else in terms of their status in the church. Someone who's divorced and remarried outside the church still is a part of the church, but they can't receive the sacraments until they have the church look at their marriage and determine it to be invalid. So that's the annulment process. So things can always be sorted out, but or hopefully can be, but. And then if that happens, then the man and the woman can be reconciled to the church and married in the church and return to the sacraments. So I'd like to talk more about that. Okay, so we're kind of moving along here with someone's divorced. Now they're still welcome in the church and can receive the sacraments. So what I would suggest is then when the emotions subside a bit, probably people don't go right from the courthouse with getting their decree of divorce and go and petition for an annulment. Probably it takes a little while to kind of get to that point, but I would suggest that if someone's considering the possibility of remarriage in the future, and even if they're not, like that old woman I was talking about, but especially if someone's thinking about getting remarried at some point, that you begin the annulment process and clarify your status in the church sooner rather than later. Right, so it need to be at the place where you're ready to do that, because you have to dig up the past, and that's hard. But do it sooner rather than later. For one thing, it can be helpful to take a closer look at what happened. You don't do that in the civil divorce process. I used to be a civil lawyer before I became a priest. I practiced for 3 years, and I, had divorce. I worked on divorces, help people with those kinds of things, and there's no counseling really that takes place there. There's not, okay, let's look at this marriage and let's learn from it and let's kind of bring some closure to it. That doesn't happen in that arena. That's not all about healing. But in the annulment process, that's at the heart of that. Yeah, we're doing the legal stuff and everything, but it's a pastoral kind of an encounter with folks. And so there's a chance for self-examination, for self-knowledge, increase in self-knowledge, self-forgiveness, self-acceptance, self-love. So that's one reason to start it earlier rather than later, because people are hurting, and the church can be there to help them with their with their pain. But it's also, the other thing is, especially if someone's thinking about possibly remarrying, that it's like I said, divorce is a civil matter. It has nothing to do with how the church understands their marriage. They're still married in the eyes of the church. So really, nobody ever thinks about this, but they probably should. They're not even in a situation to be able to begin dating at that point, because they're still, in the eyes of the church, married. So to get involved in a new relationship can become problematic if that happens before the church has said that marriage is invalid. What I find, I've seen this a zillion times. So they get civilly divorced, and kind of in our culture, in our society says, okay, it's okay to start dating then. And so they start dating, and they get emotionally involved with someone, they're starting to fall in love with someone, and then they okay, oh gosh, maybe I better kind of see if I can get an annulment so I can marry this person perhaps. Well, sometimes they're in a big hurry because maybe they're getting older, they want to have children together or something, or whatever, and so the annulment process takes a little while, and maybe they don't want to wait that long, or maybe it ends up where they don't get an affirmative decision. More often than not, it's an affirmative decision, but not necessarily. Some marriages end that are valid marriages, and then they're stuck, because then they have to choose between this person that they've fallen in love with and their Catholic faith. At least their ability to receive the sacraments. So that's what happens if people, start dating before they go through the annulment process to determine kind of where things are at. So I would suggest, okay, it's hard, I know, you have to bring things up and look at this marriage and dig up the past and all that, but it's better to do that before one starts dating again. Like I said, the person's still married at that point, and so they're not even able to date, at least from the perspective of how the church looks at things and understands things. Another thing that's hard that comes up sometimes is, okay, so I'm married and divorced, and I get an annulment. I go through the process, and then this gal that I'm dating, maybe she's not Catholic perhaps, and she was married before as well, and so that marriage is presumed to be valid, and so it needs to be looked at as well, but she doesn't want to do that. I don't believe in annulments, people say stuff like that, or whatever, and so then somebody's stuck. So that's the thing that kind of is the hardest thing for me and really tugs at my heartstrings, is when someone, they want to marry in the church. Maybe they've already married outside the church, and then they want to now be married in the church, the validation kind of a thing. But the other person won't go through the annulment process. That's a tough place to be, and that's a hard thing. And I don't know. They're looking at this. There's a synod on the family, and the Pope is going to, I think, pretty soon going to have his document on that, and maybe he'll say something about that there. But that's a tough thing. So I don't know. I know it's kind of I don't know. I think about this sometimes. So So I'm Catholic, and I was married before, and have an annulment, or I wasn't married before, and now I want to marry this gal. I'm dating this gal, and maybe, it's getting serious, and I don't know. When do you ask? So she's been married before. When do you ask her to go through the annulment process? That's how do you, so you don't want to do it too early. What does that say? I'm not sure if I want to go, be married, but I'm thinking about maybe, that's a hard thing. When do you bring that up? First date? Probably not. So that's something people have to, you have to think about when to bring up that subject. So, but I think before, I don't know, ideally before you fall in love, before, you've gone so far in this thing that it's hard to turn away from her. Because if she doesn't want to do it, or if it's a negative decision, you're in a tough spot. So just take some time to, let's see, we've got about 20 minutes. So I'll talk quickly about the annulment process and then leave you time for questions. So there's tons of misinformation, misunderstanding. There's a mystery about annulments. People just kind of accept whatever they hear out there, and it's crazy, But so I'd like to try to demystify some of the concepts and procedures, and attempt to clear up some of the misinformation and misunderstanding. So I'm going to I'll try to keep this not too technical. So we have to look at what marriage is, right? What's marriage? There's a canon 1055, the first paragraph, 1055. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. So we're hearing there, marriage has to do with covenant, man and a woman, partnership of the whole of life, which means it's permanent and exclusive, offspring, openness to offspring, the good of the spouses, it's a sacrament. Okay? So that's what marriage is. All right, so how can a marriage, what we just talked about, how can that be declared invalid? Well, in marriage, it's the only sacrament where the priest isn't the one who's kind of the minister of the sacrament, doing the sacrament. In marriage, the couple are the ministers of the sacrament. The priest is a witness. They give the sacrament to each other. It's only sacraments like that. And it all boils down to consent. That's when the marriage happens. So Canon 1057:1 says, the consent of the parties, legitimately manifested between spouses qualified by law, makes marriage. No human power is able to supply this consent. So it's all about consent of these ministers of the sacrament. And so what in the annulment process, what we're looking at is something that's not quite right with that consent. It's all about the consent. It's not what happened 10 years down the road, it's what happened at the time of consent. So sometimes what happened 10 years down the road relates to that consent. It's like, oh, this must have been missing, or they wouldn't have done this 10 years down the road. But it has to be brought back to the time of consent. Something wasn't quite right. And the annulment doesn't, it's not a good word to use actually, because it doesn't, people don't, it suggests something that isn't true. This process doesn't annul anything or say that something, that nothing happened. Yeah, something happened. There was love there probably when couple married. There's a number of years maybe. There's kids. Something happened here, but it wasn't a marriage. It wasn't a sacrament. And one thing that I think is important for people to know is that an annulment process, an affirmative decision, doesn't affect the legitimacy of children. Children are still legitimate. This process is not about trying to find a bad person at all. Might be two good people, so that's not what we're all about. It's also not a process that's concerned with rewarding somebody for being a good person. Sometimes witnesses will give us testimony and they're praising this person that, they're such a great person, they should get an annulment because they're such a good person. That's not what it's about at all. It's about looking at the consent of this couple. And so the best thing for people to do is just be honest. Here's the situation, good, bad, and different, whatever. Here's what was going on in that situation. And might be two good people, might be two bad people. It's not what we're all looking for. Was this consent, was it defective in some way? So we start with, the presumption that the marriage is valid, right? So Canon 1101, first paragraph says, the internal consent of the mind is presumed to conform to the words and signs used in celebrating the marriage. Somebody says, I'm going to marry you for life, and I'm going to be, faithful to you and open to children, whatever. We take them at their word. So that's presumed to be valid. That presumption needs to be overturned. That's what's going on in this process. And there's 3 reasons why a marriage may be declared invalid. And they're kind of, it's all wrapped up in that canon I mentioned before, 1057, paragraph 1. So it says the consent of the parties. Okay, so there could be a problem with the consent. And we're going to talk mostly about that, because, and so legitimately manifested, legitimately manifested has to do with the form of the marriage, which is called the form of the marriage. So as Catholics, we need to marry in the church. If we don't marry in the church doesn't recognize that marriage. I mean, someone can get married in a Lutheran church or some other church and get a dispensation from the church to marry there, and so then it's presumed to be valid. But if someone marries before a JP or in some other church without getting the permission of the Catholic Church, and they're Catholic, then the form is improper. So it's easy. Sometimes people say, I got an annulment in like a week. And so why is yours taking so long? Well, it's because all you have to do is show that you're Catholic, the baptismal certificate, and then the marriage certificate shows that you weren't married in the church. A few questions, clarification questions. It's not a valid marriage. All right, so that's the reason why marriage should be invalid. And then also, so the consent of the parties, legitimately manifested between persons qualified by law, makes marriage. So qualified by law means there's no impediment. So there's not a previous marriage. So that's, I can't marry somebody if I was married before or they were married before. There's age, minimum age, 16 for men and 14 for women. Impotence, somebody's not able to have sexual intercourse, that's an impediment. Other things, someone who's unbaptized and there wasn't a dispensation to marry an unbaptized person. There's these impediments. So there's the form, impediments, and then consent. So we're going to talk mostly about consent because that's the thing that's the formal case that you hear about all the time. So what's matrimonial consent? 1057, paragraph 2. Matrimonial consent is an act of the will by which a man and a woman mutually give and accept each other through an irrevocable covenant in order to establish marriage. Okay, so I boil that all down to this simple there needs to be both parties need to be ready, willing, and able to marry. Ready, willing, and able to marry. So maybe a problem with knowledge and not ready to marry because they're in error about something, like permanence of marriage, So they don't know something they need to know. With regard to being willing to marry, so that has to do with the will, obviously. And so the technical term is there could be simulation. They don't have the will to marry for life. They don't have the will to be open to children. They don't will to be faithful for life. Okay, so that would be something that could be looked at. And then capacity, not able to marry. They don't have the capacity. So there's psychological grounds. Maybe there's psychological disorder, or there's alcoholism or something. So I'll just quickly go through the grounds. We could talk forever about some of these things, but so in terms of the psychological grounds, not able to marry. A couple of quick examples of that. One is a grave lack of discretion of judgment. So a classic case, it could be all kinds of different situations, but a classic case would be, so a couple 16-year-olds, they don't know each other very well, they're not very mature. Right when they start dating, almost right away they start being, active sexually, and there's a pregnancy. Their parents are on them to marry, there's pressure, they're young, and they marry. It might be a valid marriage, but you certainly could argue that it's not, because they had a grave lack of discretion of judgment in those circumstances. So that would be a grounds for marriage not being valid. Another one would be inability to assume the essential obligations of marriage. Somebody's an alcoholic, they want to marry for life, and they're mature enough, but they're not able to give themselves fully to another person because they're married to a bottle, or there's psychological illness or something. Another grounds was simulation. Total simulation would be they're simulating marriage is like a green card situation. Somebody wants to stay in the country, so they need to marry a citizen of the United States. They don't intend anything with regard to marriage. Or partial simulation with regard to indissolubility, that these days, the secular world kind of says, marriage is as long as you're happy. And then, if you're not happy anymore, you can leave the marriage. So people kind of go with that. They don't even know that that's maybe not the way it should be. Or an intention against procreation, that somebody's not open to having children. Maybe it's a temporary, not until we get a house and get good jobs and have a certain amount of money, or maybe it's a permanent thing. If that can be proven, that is simulation. So that's a problem with consent. Or fidelity. Or there's error concerning the quality of a person, like I want to marry this person only if they're Catholic, and I think they're Catholic, but they're not Catholic. I wouldn't have married them if they weren't Catholic. So there could be all different kinds of qualities, significant kinds of things that someone's in error about. Or there's fraud. Someone's keeping something away from me, that they're questioning their sexual orientation. If I would have known that this person is gay or lesbian, I wouldn't have married her. But I didn't know that she kept that from me. So those are the kinds of grounds that can be looked at. So I'm going to go fast so you have some time for questions. Just maybe the last thing is just the procedures involved in processing a case. So not like the Archdiocese of Dubuque, our tribunal can't hear just any case we want to hear. We have to have what's called competence, or in civil law, it's jurisdiction. So we can hear cases where the marriage took place in our diocese, where the petitioner is from our diocese, and also where the respondent is from our diocese. So if one of those situations is present, then we can handle the case, process the case. And then one change, there's these new changes in the annulment process just a couple of years ago that you maybe heard about. It used to be for somebody who's not, so the respondent is not in our diocese, you had to get the permission of the judicial vicar of that diocese, but now you don't have to do that. So any of those three situations, then you need to present a petition. So the person who's the petitioner and normally goes to his or her parish, and the pastor or somebody, a deacon or somebody who knows canon law would work with them, be their advocate. They present the petition and okay, here's what I think was wrong with this marriage. Here's potential grounds to look at, one or two or more, and it goes to the tribunal. The tribunal has to accept the case, find at least a prima facie. If everything is true, that okay, and it could be proven, then yeah, maybe there could be annulment. There has to be something that they present, and it's accepted, and the parties are cited, and so here's the grounds we're going to look at. Here's the judge, and do you have any problem with any of this? And so people can have a chance to respond, the petitioner and the respondent, the two parties to the marriage. And so then they ultimately give testimony. Kind of it's a lot, it takes a while, and it's a lot of information that the church needs. the parties, and so maybe the respondent doesn't want to participate, it continues on. Often the other person doesn't want to participate, but it continues on. And then eventually witnesses, you need to name witnesses, and they give testimony, judge makes a decision, and it used to be, so that's in the first instance, it's kind of like trial court kind of a thing, and it used to be where it had to go to the appeals court, the second instance court. Somebody, another diocese, that there's 3 judges, kind of lawyers, who are kind of looking over the shoulders of the judge at the first instance, the trial court. And so there has to be 2 affirmative decisions, but they changed that. Pope Francis changed it, so now there just needs to be 1 affirmative decision. So someone could appeal and go to the second court, but that's not automatic anymore. So just a couple of last things, then I'll take questions. Pastors are told to not set a wedding date until someone is free to marry. So they're not supposed to set wedding dates when the annulment is in process, because you don't know when it's going to be concluded. So how do you know when to set the date? And then you also know if it's going to be affirmative. And you make that mistake once, and set a date, and then it doesn't work out, and that's a really tough situation, because they've put money down on halls, and they made all these plans and invitations. So they're not supposed to set dates until wedding dates, till the couple's free to marry. The time it takes is, I don't know. I used to tell people, 9 months. Is kind of average time, but I don't know. We are caught up in our diocese, and now there's not the second instance thing where it has to go to another court. It could be 6 months. It could be 4 months even. It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to take forever. It can be dragged out for some reason, depending on if they're having trouble gathering evidence. But 4 months is about as fast as it can happen. 6 months, that could be a kind of an average time. And the cost is, I think it's $450. People hear about it being thousands of dollars. Well, it's not. And someone, if they have a trouble with coming up with that kind of money, they need to present their tax returns, and they can be reduced or not charged at all, or just waived. So that's some stuff that I can, just want to kind of present to you. But then, I want to hear any questions that you have about any of this.
If someone's been, or a couple has been married in one diocese, and they've moved to a different diocese, and that's where they've gotten their civil divorce, can they file for annulment in that diocese, or do they come back to the?
They can file for it doesn't matter whether civil divorce happened, they can seek an annulment in any diocese where the marriage took place, the petitioner is, or the respondent is. So, and if maybe that could be 3 different dioceses, it could be the same diocese, it could be 2 dioceses. Those are the 3 things. I mean, another one is where most of the evidence is, but that could be a 4th place, but nobody ever hardly uses that.
And then if the respondent doesn't respond at all?
Sometimes the respondent, even they're angry, and so this person, my former spouse, wants this, so I'm going to be automatically opposed to it, even though if it's an affirmative decision, it affects both of them the same, and that person could be married in the church too if they wanted to, but a lot of times they don't want to participate. Right. It continues on. I mean, ideally you want to have both of them, because they're the 2 people that are married. They have the best testimony, but the testimony of the witnesses needs to be stronger than if you don't have that other party's testimony. But it continues on. Yeah, that happens a lot. Yeah.
What's the difference between an annulment and a divorce?
A divorce, it used to be in Iowa, it had to be cause, there had to be some grounds for a divorce, but now it's no-fault divorce. So people can get divorced just because, they have to go through the process, and there's a waiting period, but otherwise you just get, the marriage breaks down. And so an annulment is way back to the time of consent, like I was saying. We are looking at whether this was a marriage. Divorce, it could have been a wonderful marriage, and and valid, and I just don't want to be married anymore. I found somebody else, whatever. And so that's just a civil thing. Annulment is looking, for us, the sacrament happens when the couple gives consent, right? So they're the ministers of the sacrament. So we're looking at that consent. Was it valid or not? So we're going way back to the very beginning. So what happened at the end of the marriage, to end the marriage, often you can find seeds of that at the beginning. It doesn't just come out of the clear blue sky. A lot of times that comes from somewhere, but you have to tie it into their consent. There's something wrong with their consent. So then there wasn't a marriage. So with the divorce, there was a marriage, and now it's ended. With an annulment, there was love, there was children, there was years maybe, but there wasn't a marriage from the very beginning. It wasn't valid. There's something that was wrong with someone's consent. Yeah, it wasn't sacrament, because that's what we're all about, is sacrament. And so with our understanding of the sacrament of marriage it's consent that makes that sacrament. So it's not, it just wasn't a sacrament. It wasn't a valid sacrament. Yeah.
For somebody that knows somebody who might have been married in the church and then remarried without an annulment, you said that they could still participate in some way in the life of the church. If you know somebody like that, what are like the boundaries as far as what they can and can't?
Yeah, that's the thing that they just think that they're not welcome in the church, and which really, I was saying, makes me so sad, because they need to be there. The church, they need to be a part of a community. So they marry outside the church, they can't receive the sacraments, basically. They can't, and they're not in good standing in the church, so they can't be a Eucharistic minister or be in parish council, those kinds of things. But you would encourage them to be there, listen to the scripture, long for the Eucharist, and encourage them to regularize their situation if they can. And, but otherwise, come to the, potlucks and do everything. You can't go to communion, but otherwise, that's what the church says in those official documents too. It says that, the church herself says that, but people don't get that message. They don't feel like, I'm not worthy, or people look down on them or something. We need to welcome them to be part of the church still. They are still part of the church.
Well, the reason I asked is because I ran into somebody just yesterday that was in that situation, and they felt like they couldn't even be at Mass.
They can be at Mass. So here's what it says. There's Familiaris Consortio, an apostolic exhortation issued by John Paul II in 81. Pastors and parish communities are bound to stand by the faithful who find themselves in this situation of married, outside the church, with attentive love. They too belong to the church. They are entitled to pastoral care, and they should take part in the church's life. And then it says, they can't be admitted to the Eucharist, and it kind of goes into that, but it's saying they are a part of the church. They're not outside the church. They married outside the church, but that affects their ability to receive communion, because they're not in communion with the church when they do that, so they can't receive communion, but they are still part of the church. It is still their home. It is still their family.
So, clarification. So was the person married outside the church, or is not?
They got married in the church, and then they had a divorce, and then they married somebody else outside the church.
Right, yeah.
Okay, I was trying to just distinguish between someone who's divorced has not taken up another
Right,
place.
someone who's divorced and is not remarried, they are, there's no difference between them and anybody else.
Right.
They're not living together with this person. We still see them as married, but they're, right.
So and they can, it's not just the Eucharist they're not allowed to receive.
It's right,
also
any of the sacraments.
Of reconciliation. So in order to receive those again, they have to leave that union.
Well, they need to go through the annulment process and marry in the church, go to reconciliation, because they kind of turned away from the church and remarried outside the church. And then hopefully they can always go through, there's always a way home. You can go through the annulment process and be married in church. Then it's back to, full. The other, I don't want to get too, I don't know. There is, it's in that document, Familiaris Consortio. So say my spouse, my civil law spouse, doesn't want to go through the annulment process, and I'm stuck. Well, there is this thing called like a brother-sister relationship. If they live as brother-sister, maybe they don't want to separate, because there's children, because somebody needs, whatever, they can't live on their own for some reason. They can live as brother and sister and return to the sacraments. So here's what John Paul says. Reconciliation through sacramental confession, which opens the way to reception of the Eucharist, can only be granted in the case of repentance over what has happened and a readiness to understand a way of life that is no longer in contradiction to the indissolubility of marriage. Concretely, this means that if for serious reasons, such as the children's upbringing, the new union cannot be dissolved, then the two partners must bind themselves to live in complete continence. In other words, live as brother and sister. And that happens. So sometimes, someone wants to return to the sacraments. They're in this invalid marriage. They've been married outside the church. And they, so now they have cancer. And so that's often easy situation. They're not involved. They're not involved in a sexual relationship because of their disease, or maybe they're old. And so then you work with the couple. Okay, you're living as brother and sister. You can bring them back to the sacraments then. I've done that many times. So often it's that kind of situation. They're old or sick or something, but it'd be a harder thing to do if they're healthy, to live as brother and sister, obviously. So there is a way to return to the sacraments even in a tough situation. Yeah.
What proportion of annulment petitions are not granted, and what are some of the reasons why?
Most of them are granted. That shocks people. The ones that maybe aren't going to go all the way through kind of get sorted out along the way. The tribunal maybe doesn't accept the petition, or they're not able to gather testimony, and the judge is struggling, and so they just drop the case or something. Most of the ones go all the way through are affirmative. The way I look at it is there's a reason why the marriage ended, right? So some reason why the marriage ended. Usually you can trace it back to time of consent. Right now, a lot of the marriages are invalid, I think, because of an error with regard to indissolubility. There's a divorce mentality out there. The culture accepts divorce. Young people, they think like maybe, I want to marry for life. I hope my marriage will last for life. I think it'll last for life, maybe. But they know in their heart of hearts, if they're not happy, they become unhappy, they're out of there. They're not going to go through the pastoral mystery, the dying and the rising, and suffering. I'm suffering, I'm out of here. So that's the grounds for, that's not a valid marriage. So it's hard to prove that because they don't say that. You have to, use implicit proof and stuff. But yeah, so that marriage ends. So because of that, and so you have to bring that back. That was there at the time of consent. So yeah, so there's mostly, if you can get some witness testimony, people are honest and they're perceptive, you can. We need to wrap it up. But most of them are affirmative. The ones that kind of get washed out that are valid marriages, those get washed out on the way. And the ones that go all the way through, most of them are affirmative decisions. So anyway, it's time for the next thing. Thanks for coming to this presentation, being an attentive audience. Appreciate it.